I'm just watching the number of attendees, watching that number rise. So welcome everyone as you're joining. We'll get started here in a few minutes. Want to give people a chance to get settled in.
Are they going to be any refreshments, Andrea?
Only if you brought them.
Anybody like an orange? It's actually a clementine.
Yes. Okay, I definitely I'm still seeing the numbers start to really climb. So I'll go ahead and give it one more minute. Okay, I think we're starting to stabilize here a little bit with folks joining. So welcome everyone to the second Lunch and Learn discussion session. This session came about as follow-on to our Agile Champions series that we hosted in August of 2022. Jim actually had the idea, and so we are making this happen. We will have 3. So this is the second of 2022. Our last session of 2022 will be November 17th. So save that date. Dave Smith and Daryl, who's the CPM team's coordinator for all of this. Based on the Agile Champions series, one of our last presentations was to build a schedule, Agile schedule document. Daryl has built one. So in November, we plan to review that and see how everyone else is doing coming out of that Agile Champions series. Yeah, if you too have been building your Agile schedule guide. So that should be a great way to end 2022. I feel like December, everyone will be very busy, and then we'll start up again in 2023 with a whole new list of topics. This session is being recorded. So if you wanted to listen to it, you'll be able to access that in the future. And what I'm going to do as the discussion happens, I am going to take some notes so we can make sure that in 2023, we don't inadvertently repeat topics. And each time we're going to do this, I will solicit a few key members from the IPMD Agile Committee to help address the questions that folks have. And at any time, please give feedback, type in the chat. We definitely want this to be a very active discussion, informal discussion, just sharing all of the knowledge and the different applications of Agile and EVM that we have seen. We know there's been lots of mistakes out there. Some of us on the Agile Committee have made them. So anyway, we're just here to share that experience and have a great discussion. So today,
I just want to say for the record, I've never made any mistakes, but I've heard that other people
have. Very good, Jim. You are an exception. So the three folks, today's content, we are going to be more focused on the Agile side of things. We've had Agile methodology question come up. Does the methodology chosen, how does that impact the implementation? Some folks have asked about requirements output and how does that impact the way you might want to do a schedule. And to answer those questions today, that's our theme for today, we have Jim Duffy, Renee Frazier, and Suzette Johnson as well. And we also have a scheduling representative, Andrew Witowski. It looks like he's not here yet. I know he was a little bit iffy for today. So anyway, if Andrew pops in, it'd be great to hear from him as well. So without further ado, I figure I'll go ahead and jump right into the first question. So let's just start with how many different Agile methodologies have you guys seen out there?
A lot. Yeah, so just to get started, there are a lot of different frameworks and Agile methods, and even some lean frameworks that are out there that are being used. I think there is, if you kind of look at some of the surveys that are out in the Agile community, that there's a report that goes out every year from what used to be version 1. The most recent one showing that 2 frameworks still kind of lead, which is Scrum and some of those XP practices, and then for scaling, Scaled Agile is still the primary Scaled Agile framework, and then followed by Scrum at Scale. And I think we're seeing an emergence of Kanban, especially in areas where they are doing a lot of DevOps, or as we're pulling in some of the manufacturing side of the house. Those are my observations. Someone might see things differently.
Susan, I think you have the broad landscape pretty well defined, and most of what I've seen is in the Scrum area with a small amount of Kanban, but mostly it's confirming that report. It's mostly Scrum deployments.
I would say the same thing. Am I echoing?
Yes. You might have to mute something. Maybe your computer.
There. That's better, right?
Thank you. Yes.
Anyway, yes, we have Scrum. I'd say safe Scaled Agile, a instantiation of Scaled Agile framework is most common in the company I'm working with. And also I'd say Scrumban, if anyone's heard of that. I don't know if that's an official term, but it's kind of a combination of Scrum and Kanban, where you're kind of taking the best of best worlds, doing a little bit more like Kanban, but you're still adding those retrospectives and maybe regular planning sessions and things like that. But the commitment that you're making is more of a Kanban-like commitment versus a time-boxed sprint commitment of work.
Excellent. So we know that there are many methodologies, and those may be the common ones. How does your approach to building a WBS or a schedule, does that change based on the methodology chosen, please?
So
I would
I'll
say
start. Oh,
yeah, go ahead, Susan. No, you go ahead.
Okay. Sure, because then you all can provide the details.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think so. One of the things I'm observing first is, even before we get into talking about our methods or frameworks that we use, is really trying to understand what it means to have a productized WBS and how we're going to shape that WBS from a product perspective. And then from there, we start thinking about maybe what framework we want to use for implementation. It does help, though, to have that common understanding, that common language. So we're all kind of speaking in terms of, as we're shaping our product, are we talking about features or capabilities, and just having common understanding that way. I think that's where the framework helps early on. I don't know. Again, those are just my observations. Have you seen things differently or in addition to that?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. Whether you're doing Scrum at scale, you're doing SAFe, the WBS still boils down to, especially if you're using a product-based WBS, which is the most current, I believe, it still boils down to defining the product, and then it's whether the control accounts below that are affected by your hierarchical structure. Because at the end of the day, you could have a SAFe, a scaled agile deployment where you have multiple Scrum teams organized in release trains, et cetera. But I think the WBS is still going to represent basically a product, the software product, and then capabilities below that. So I think in my experience, the framework you're using doesn't heavily impact the variety of the WBS, I guess I would say, or the structure itself, which I think
Jim,
is a good
kind of, yeah, and I was kind of thinking in line with you, Jim, is that the methodology doesn't necessarily impact the WBS. However, and just like Suzette said, if you're developing a product-based WBS, the only thing I was thinking, though, is that if you're using SAFe, Scaled Agile Framework, or Scrum of Scrums or something, you probably have a larger project and more, so you might be bringing in more aspects of the system engineering and hardware and things like that might impact some of those other levels of the WBS that you would have. But generally speaking, I would agree at that software level, especially that it doesn't necessarily affect the WBS.
Yeah, I guess the one possibility is that if you had such a large deployment and you were doing SAFe significantly large, that you might decide or opt to specify a certain product breakdown as a way of decomposing the problem. So your WBS actually might be multiple products that would ultimately roll up to a single product. So you might decide to break it up that way, just for decomposition purposes. So generally speaking, a more complex deployment might lead to a more complex representation in your WBS structure. So maybe it's more driven by size or complexity of your project, more so than necessarily the framework you're using.
Exactly, and that's the exact point I wanted to get out from all of you. I think the key takeaway is that common language that may arise out of that framework. And Jim, you touched on the approach to deployment. And I'm going to use a bad word here, depending on how you make the deployment happen. You may have quote unquote, gates or demos or ceremonies. And some of those ceremonies may be addressed a certain way based on your framework.
Mm-hmm.
So really, it really doesn't matter which framework people use. I think it's important for us as EVM folks and schedulers to be able to adapt and just, fold yourself into whatever terms that contract is using.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just to build off of that, because it does, when you get into implementation, especially, and you have that work breakdown structure and you start shaping backlogs around that, having common language becomes really important, because the words such as like the word capability has so many different meanings depending on either where you sit in the organization or your framework. So just having all of that really well defined so that as you start towards implementation, we have that understanding, that common understanding of what is actually a capability.
Mm-hmm.
And all the other words that are confusing. What is a release?
Correct. Multiple meanings. Correct.
Yeah, the
So-
semantics are incredibly important. It is a recurring theme, even on well-established programs, to constantly make sure that you're using the same semantics so that you have effective communication and effective execution.
And I'm really hoping to get some feedback through the chat for the folks who are called in. What has confused you about the different frameworks, about the different terms? Would you please ask us any questions so maybe we can help keep some of those semantics separate for you to get some clarity on those? I'll just give folks a minute to type.
Am I allowed to type in there too?
Absolutely.
You're not allowed to have questions. You're providing all the answers.
Yeah, and for me, like there are certain terms, like even the term Agile itself. Someone will reach out and say, we're doing Agile. And I'm like, great, what does that mean? Oh, we're going to have releases. Great. Explain to me your context. So I'm starting to learn that certain words that are said to me, like either they make me want to cringe or they fuel me, to ask more questions.
I've actually started avoiding using the word Agile. I purposefully will use adaptive or incremental or something like that because for some people it's become overloaded to mean something completely different, or it gets unfortunately a negative reaction. So I use other words when necessary.
Yeah, and in terms of implementation, and hopefully I'm not deviating from the kind of intent of this conversation, but one of the things that I've seen is organizations are so committed, right, to empowering teams and decentralized decision making and pushing decisions to the right level of the organization, which is extremely important so that we can make decisions quickly with avoiding some of the bureaucracy that we might have had in the past. At the same time, I think sometimes there's a struggle to understand when do we have to have a level of commonality, when do we have to have a level of, I'll use loosely, standards, so that we can actually gather metrics. Because what I'm finding is some level of standardization with flexibility of implementation of how they're actually going to build the product. But it's still important, or if teams are doing things slightly different, when it is time to pull the metrics together to really understand our progress against those capabilities, it can be difficult, if not impossible. So having, right, I don't know, those are things that I've observed in terms of having some level of standardization, and doesn't mean teams get to do whatever they want, even though we are empowering them and we do understand and respect decentralization. So I don't know if you have what your observations might have been in those areas.
Yeah, that actually interesting, Sue. That is where I spend 90% of my time in Agile deployments is actually putting that standard processes, standard tooling, standard training in place so that there is a common way of speaking, a common way of evaluating, a common way of measuring for that very reason. And while still, ironically, and this is actually a lean idea, and it comes straight from like the Toyota way and things like that, is having standard work actually accelerates people. It accelerates performance because you don't waste time wondering what the process is, what template am I supposed to use to report on this particular aspect of my performance, those kinds of things. So standard work, standard processes are actually enablers. And as I said, that's where I spend a lot of my time, is putting those in place and actually constantly reminding folks that they exist and training people on them and things like that. So no, that's a really good observation.
And I see a question coming into the chat. So, related to the application of agile, iterative thinking. And, I sigh a little bit. Our default, yes, is agile and software. But some of us are definitely seeing the iterative concepts applied to hardware and all sorts of different industries. And I would say we probably don't have a lot of good things documented for the non-software. But I know that the three folks I'm looking at, I know they're very capable of applying those concepts to anything. So would you guys just talk a little bit about, manufacturing, aircraft design, hardware, some of the trends that you're seeing there, just to encourage people to start to apply what they know on software in other areas, please?
Yeah, my experience is mostly in the software realm, so I'll defer to Suzette or Renee if they have any experience in the hardware realm.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start. So I actually also work in an aircraft company. So we have in my current area where I'm at right now, in addition to other ones I've had in the past, we are applying Agile methodologies to multiple aspects of the program. So for those that are familiar with Scaled Agile framework, we started out with a set of teams that were software only. And then we started to add teams that were our systems engineers that were defining the requirements for those software people. And then we started to add multiple systems teams because we were doing a product line where we were developing software to meet multiple programs' needs. So we had different systems teams representing those programs. Then we went and added hardware teams because we started to realize as we grew that as we were developing our hardware, it was really nice to align our software teams to recognize when they wanted to have builds to check out the hardware and stuff. And then we also added our security teams. So we have security certification. So our security team started to get integrated. So as we built our knowledge of our Agile methodologies and planning across those teams, and not just earned value planning, but planning that happens within Agile teams of their features and their stories and things, the mechanisms that we used with everyone planning together and committing to work within timeframes, in our case, we call them increments or releases. We realized the benefit of having all of those people involved, and it actually became teams and disciplines came to us saying, I want to be a part of that, because what they started to realize was they saw other people being aligned and being much more efficient at their work. And unless they were a part of it, they didn't, they realized that they were running behind. And so I found that interesting, actually, to see the growth organically happen. Not that we were forcing it down anyone's throat. It just ultimately there were people saying, I want to go to your increment planning sessions. I want to be a part of that. And we grew over a couple of years. In fact, we grew so much that we split into two totally different, what we call product lines or release trains, if you're familiar with Scaled Agile framework.
Yeah, Renee, just to kind of build off what you said, that is almost, I would say exactly what I have seen to be the rollout over and over again. Starts in hardware, then systems engineering, and then it kind of moves across the different functions. And then it gets not only to hardware, and then manufacturing is a little bit of an interesting situation when you start pulling in manufacturing, because what does that really look like? And do they really need to be, or if you look at the value stream for manufacturing, what I'm sort of my hypothesis, because I don't think industry has really documented this well, but based on my observations, is that the front end of manufacturing kind of shifts to the left towards and more integrated with those development teams. But when it comes time to actually the hardware on the floor assembly, is that really agile or is that lean, or maybe it's what is that preference at that point? I think we're still trying to answer that. I think it also depends on your organization, because I think Tesla would probably say they're agile all the way through. So it might be somewhat of how your organization is set up and the product that you're building. So I've witnessed the same things, and we're at an interesting stage now of looking at agile hardware design all the way through manufacturing.
Very good. So that sounds like a self-fulfilling backlog that this committee, working across ADAPT and the NDIA SE division, we can keep adding things to our backlog to make sure that we document these evolving things. And a clarifying question, is Agile similar to just-in-time manufacturing or Six Sigma?
I would say no. I mean, just in time is sort of a supply chain issue of trying to get, your supply chain truncated. Agile is a methodology that's sort of an iterative feedback loop, so they're really not the same. It's a whole different concept. I understand the similarity would be trying to save time, right? But the concepts are different completely. The methodology of what you're trying to accomplish, other than saving time. Well, no, you don't really save time. Well, it depends. You're being more efficient with Agile. So if it takes longer to be more efficient, that's not necessarily saving time if you're looking for an increased value in your development, right? But in just in time, you're definitely trying to truncate your supply chain. You're not keeping warehouses. You're not, having trucks on the backlog. You're not, it's a whole different ballgame. That's my experience.
And I think,
yeah. So I'm gonna contradict a little bit about what Wendy said, because I started my career in manufacturing. And when Agile came around, I found that a lot of the concepts that were used in Agile evolved out of the manufacturing, maybe not specifically just in time, but the lean and the Kanban concepts that came out of just in time. So I know when people look at Scrum and they call it a Scrum board, it's really a Kanban board, and it's very similar to what you use in manufacturing as you move equipment through and you think about work in process and lead time and making sure you have a continuous pipeline of work for people to work on, whether they're assembling a product or they're writing code and then moving into test and things like that. So I think the CI/CD pipeline is very similar to just in time, but a little bit more abstracted from it. So to me, all this stuff, I put in the chat, if you, in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, right, the book The Goal by Eliyahu Goldratt was really popular. Then he came out with a book called Critical Chain. Then he passed away, and now some other authors picked up the concept with the Phoenix Project and a couple, I think it's the Unicorn something. So there's books that if you listen, if you read them or listen to them on audio, it sounds just like all those concepts from 20 plus years ago. I think maybe sometimes we don't think of that because not a lot of us work in manufacturing, right? That we have big software background, so we think we're inventing everything new, but it's really not, right? A lot of these concepts came from Henry Ford in the 1950s.
Yeah, so with regard to the Phoenix Project, when Gene Kim wrote that book, and it's IT, Agile, lean, probably more lean, Agile, a little bit maybe on the lean side for IT systems. He actually read or listened to the goal many times. So thinking how he could take those ideas from lean manufacturing and then apply them in that story that he wrote, which is really fascinating. It's just very insightful. And I think that was part of my experience as well, because I've been implementing Agile since 2005, started primarily in software, although there was even hardware components at that time. But it was really when I was working on a radar system and we applied Agile in software. There were just so many problems, right? So at that point, you have nothing to lose. Might as well try Agile because nothing else is working. And they, had a really great turnaround. And then all of a sudden, I realized, but we still couldn't deliver because the rest of the value stream was serving as, was blocking, right? There was a block, there was an impediment, we couldn't get through the bottleneck. And I was talking to someone about that, and that's when they recommended it. I read the goal back in 2016, I think that was, and that's when I realized that these principles and some of the practices have to apply across the whole value stream in order to, or that bottleneck just keeps shifting anyway. But if you don't have the hardware aligned when it's time to deliver, you still can't deliver your product. And I do think there must be enough. I'm not a Six Sigma expert, but I will say I have a cousin. She actually works in healthcare. She does their time reporting and their finances and make sure people gets paid. She has no expertise about this at all, but she just listens to stories that I tell. And she actually went to some Six Sigma training in the healthcare industry. And she came back and she was asking me, she's like, do you do Six Sigma? Because so much of what you say, I heard similar talk in that class. And so there must be enough similarity that she was making connections, and maybe some of that's around improvements and measuring improvements and like the retrospectives. But anyway, it was just an interesting observation.
Yes, and very good. I think I want to sort of summarize this and then move on to a more specific topic. So it really does seem like there are overlaps in everything that we can do. So the more that we are open and flexible to apply what we're learning, I think that's going to push us all forward, which is also part of why I said when I walk into a new program, I just sort of listen so I can adapt to what they're saying, how they're doing things. Not necessarily focused on what they specifically call it. So that's great to hear from everyone about how much these concepts are overlapping. So the next, very specific question, and this was one of the last things that came up at the end of our previous discussion. So how are the requirements? We still get requirements on our contract. The term used last time was, blueprinting the requirements. So if we could just talk a little bit about how the actual requirements that we still get on our contracts, how do they feed how you may think about a schedule, a WBS, anything like that.
And yeah,
So go ahead.
we're both think to talk, right? I was just going to say, I think so. I work, in the defense world, and you still at this state, you still have a lot of traditional, requirements expressed as, what they call A-specs but in the Agile realm, there's a translation of the requirements or the statement of work into a set of high-level pieces of functionality, which I will use the term capability here to describe that. And but there's a mapping of those capabilities back to the contractual documentation. So there's always an understanding of when you're working on that capability, which is in the program's product backlog, there's an understanding of what aspect of the contract is that capability, or what requirements from the contract is that capability implementing. And then from there, you have the traditional, decomposition, increment by increment of those capabilities into features, but ultimately it all flows back into the contractual requirements. So there is a decomposition process that happens. So that's how I would describe it in a nutshell from my experience.
I would agree in the relation to the contract requirements, or what we also use to define what are our top level capabilities. And that's where you kind of get your roadmap and your high level structure for the products that you're actually delivering. So what are the capabilities, and then you're taking those, and that's what you're breaking down into our features. And even in our case, as we're developing features, all of our features are really implementing requirements that we had in our contracts or in our higher level system specs. So we aren't fully in a sometimes in a puristic Agile sense, people think that everything that you have, say in Jira or your Agile tool, is the only place where you define requirements, and that's not the way we operate. We do have requirements coming from our customer. We do still write requirement specifications, and then those are all just our features and our stories, and things that we have as we define our work are all based upon our implementation plan to meet those requirements that are defined.
Yeah, and I think that's where, as we start looking at the digital capabilities and the digital infrastructure, and you start, pulling that digital thread all the way from where your requirements are, which might be in Doors, for example, through your models and Cameo to your Jira implementation and your backlog. And then you have that traceability so that you can understand, how are we actually meeting those requirements, and then how have we modeled them out? Because there are still, to the point that you both have made, there are still requirements, right? Especially when you have physical systems involved. There are some just physics around those, that you have to meet in order for something to launch. So I'm in agreement with everything that you said, and but I think that's, again, that digital thread and those digital capabilities are helping to kind of show the sort of integration and the touch points of how we're meeting those requirements.
Yeah, and I think the key in our implementation that I think of is, although we are taking those requirements, the one main difference from a traditional program is that we are incrementally, in very small increments, building up that functionality, and not from the requirements portion and then the design portion. It's literally doing the analysis up front to break that down into the features or functionality so that you can iteratively develop and integrate and test those individual pieces, therefore building your system up functionally.
Mm-hmm.
And I see the comment here. I believe it fits. It's in sync. You gather requirements, you do the gap fit analysis, and then map those requirements as you guys were talking about. And I'm going to do sort of a tangent here on that topic. When it comes to educating the folks who are, EVM centric and very linear, we hear some things like, well, if you're removing a requirement, then your contract value can drop. And people seem to think, well, if you're removing a requirement, then my budget can decrease from a work package. So can you talk about how you may debunk that myth and what it means to you guys to manage the project, more holistically, to deliver the overall product? and that's a hard one. I know I'm putting you and everyone else on the call on the spot, but I seem to keep running into that, and I'm not having much success saying that, just because, 3 work requirements are satisfied a different way, there's not necessarily a contract value impact of that because we're focused on delivering the whole contract.
So just so I understand, because I might not be clearly understanding the question, are you talking about like when features are changing and being modified? And as long as it's still within the scope? I mean, so that's one thing that I see, that our features, are always being refined.
It's part of that as well,
Right.
Suzette. Yes, it's all of that fits. The core
Yeah, because I
requirements
do
may
know, like,
change, the implementation details of the feature, in my mind, all of that fits, and it tends to lead the truly, EVM only, they're looking for something to change and say, well, you give budget back, or you don't. So I'm just trying to help that whole big picture. So how we can help our other folks see that it's okay, for things to change. It doesn't automatically equate to a change in budget or scope.
right. So I can talk.
Go ahead, Suzette.
ahead.
You spoke up.
No, go ahead. You're fine.
I was just going to say that that's where what came to mind was the importance of the features acceptance criteria and definition of done. If they are agreed upon, basically, having a specific goal for a feature, and ideally that is something you're doing with the customer. And so, by definition, if the goal of the feature is met, not necessarily in exactly the same way as when the feature was started, because of what was learned as the feature was implemented, but overall, all appropriate stakeholders agree that the goal of the feature was met. By definition, that means no scope change happened, and therefore there is no necessity of changing any of the baseline parameters, the earned value baseline parameters of the feature in that situation. And again, by definition, since the goal was met, any changes in approach or any changes in implementation are just that. They're basically just implementation details that always happened and happened well before Agile came on the scene. So I think that's again where semantics are so important, is understanding what we mean by scope and understand what we mean by implementation details, and having agreement on that. So when you get into those inevitable change situations, you can, as easily as possible, express what kind of change are you really talking about? At what level is that change relevant?
So then I think that's, and I'm processing what you guys were saying. So then the key takeaway to bring back to other people, if something changes, our answer is, well, we have to look at what level of the change is that relevant.
Mm-hmm.
If we change it in a story, the work package, the feature, still completes with the exit criteria of that work package feature. Therefore, there is no impact at the contractual level.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really applying that question to all levels of change, external, contract, control account, work package, to really assess, what the impact is.
Yeah, and it usually does come down, in the context of Agile, it usually does come down to the feature, because the feature is actually where the actual work is being done. A control account is a container for planning purposes, but the work is actually done at the feature/work package level. So that's really where that conversation happens. And I think the more that you have, that idea of customer interaction right? The more that folks have the agile mindset of the value of customer collaboration, versus, contract negotiation. I mean, it makes that much more, a much easier conversation. But ultimately, you have to agree on what the scope of that feature is. And if you've exceeded that scope, then it's a baseline change. If you have not, then it isn't.
Yeah, Jim, I really like the way you brought in the acceptance criteria aspect of that too. And I totally agree with that, because when we get to requirements, in reality, the addition or subtraction requirements, even in a traditional program, depending on how that is looked at and what level it is, doesn't necessarily affect the EV. But one thing I have ran across a lot is concerns about people with regards to scope creep. If we have everyone involved and you're defining a lot of things, there's always a concern that there's going to be, how do we avoid scope creep? And I guess the one thing I've always said, if you're really following the methodologies and having everyone involved in the planning and more knowledge and pushing decisions down more, there's going to be a lot more awareness of things. So you still have to manage those scope changes, whatever they are. I mean, so there's still the same decision-making process that happens when you understand more things. But you're going to have greater visibility earlier to those to be able to make those decisions than you would in a traditional program using Agile methodologies.
Yep.
Yeah, and so one of the things that Jim was talking about, and some of it was cutting out. I think I'm having a little bit of a cell phone connection problem. Was the importance of that acceptance criteria, both at the feature level and at the capability level. So we started talking earlier about, some of the sort of, we'll say, lessons learned based on mistakes. So, I've been doing this a long time, and early on we didn't have acceptance criteria. And we realized really fast things just weren't getting done. And so the importance of the acceptance criteria at the feature level and then at that capability level, because that really helps define the scope and what we actually know when something is done. Learned by experience, learned the hard way.
Yep. And one of
And
the
I agree
guests,
with the comments. I was going to say, I agree with the comments that are coming up here too on the MVP, understanding that. And also there are, you do, right, can't be afraid to take requirements or features out. I mean, the more the quicker you learn that a feature is significantly more expensive maybe than something else or significantly more complex, then yes, those discussions and decisions can happen, and those decisions are to be made, as opposed to waiting because waiting till you're done because you've done things in the traditional fashion.
yeah, I think one of the key challenges there is that when you look across a program, basically a contract in like in a company like BAE or Raytheon or wherever you are, there's a sense that Agile is an engineering thing, and so the folks who aren't in engineering that are supporting the program, such as finance or contracts or accounting, even the program office, they don't really see Agile as a business process. They see it as an engineering process. So they, when you talk about taking requirements out, they're not fully have the mindset of that's actually in some cases of great value to the program. And it's of great value to do it and set up processes that do it as easily and quickly as possible so that you can move more quickly and deliver more functionality at higher quality and all those other things. All those, what I call Agile mindset concepts, seem to, if they only reside in engineering, then, it's basically the program is not fully benefiting from all that mindset has to offer. And oftentimes, so it stated positively on programs where they get it, they've streamlined their, not just their engineering processes, but their financial processes, so that if we need to, and it is a scope change, we can quickly implement a BCR and capture those lessons learned of that. I don't need that requirement and move on, right? So the whole organization is ideally very adaptive, not just engineering. I guess that's my main point.
So we have about 10 minutes left. Do we want to take on the comments about the MVP? And, relative to, and I'm just going to throw something out there. So do we baseline the MVP? Does producing the MVP, is that what we capture in our PMB? Or do we document, do we plan to produce more than the MVP? And then, if we deliver the MVP, we say that everything was a success.
My take on that is you use the MVP to prioritize your backlog. So at the beginning of the program, you baseline everything. You use your MVP to prioritize your backlog to deliver your MVP first. And then based on what you learned from that delivery, you decide whether that's enough. And then if necessary, make a contract change. So that's my overarching thought on MVP.
Yeah, and I think in addition to that, there's also the other use case where we define the MVP, just as you were saying, but it might just be that we want to have early understanding of what it is that we're building, right? So we might have a minimum viable product, but maybe it's more of a smaller prototype so that we can test out certain capabilities, and as we're building that larger cyber physical solution. So we could define that early MVP to get some early feedback as we're building the larger system.
So my takeaway from that is, just like our other discussions, you throw out the word agile. Well, how do you mean? You throw out the word release. You have to understand that. So it sounds like the word or letters MVP is also very relative to that. And if your goal is that the MVP is to build a smaller prototype, I'm assuming your WBS would somehow capture that. And then you would continue on beyond the MVP, and you would have a different strategy to execute the rest of your contract beyond that MVP. So do you guys have a little bit of insight at how that could change your WBS and your schedule tasks, depending on what an MVP means to you?
I've actually seen contracts when you have multiple, but it's not just one MVP. It could be many MVPs. There could be, you could take your contract and work with the customer and say, okay, for each of these pieces of functionality, what's the minimum viable product of this for the intent that Suzette was talking about with, what's the minimalist version of this? And let's look at that first and then learn from that. And that will then help us to decide how much further we want to go, right? So, because what's happening here is you have basically two worlds coming together. One world being this idea that the customer gives you a contract, a 3-year contract to produce all this functionality, but they have enough self-awareness to realize that these are just thoughts we have. We think we need all this functionality, but we want to use a iterative approach to actually find that out for sure. So we'll give you a contract, has this functionality in it, but we're going to identify several MVPs to test out first, and then we'll decide whether we're going to execute the rest of the contract, that type of thing. Having said all that, you may be laid into the WBS where the MVP functionality is placed in the WBS at almost prioritized first. Maybe I'm thinking more of the IMS, but we're going to put that up front in the schedule, and then we'll put the rest of the contract and the rest of the scope and the budget later on in the schedule. and then, we'll adjust as we go increment over increment. So it's a lot in there, I know, but that's how I think about it.
Yeah, and I agree. When you were talking about the IMS, I can definitely see that relationship, right? That would be something you would see kind of earlier, ideally.
Right.
I think that's how we prioritize it. That makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, in Agile language, the MVPs could be your early experiments for what the system should be, right? And then you learn from that, and make decisions based on that. Is that getting at the question, you think, Andrea, or are we missing the mark?
Yes, 100%. And it took me a minute to jump over because I like that sort of bluff, that the MVPs are the early experiments on what the system should be.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really like that. And the comment, yeah, so how could that MVP avoid the scope creep? To your point that after developing that, that's when you decide where you go next.
Yeah.
I would guess if you go ahead.
I was just going to say MVP is a concept in the sense it's like design to cost or design for sigma. It's basically it's an idea, it's a mindset of saying, let's look at this system and let us try to express what are the characteristics of a minimal viable version of this system, right? So it's an expression of what that, with the characteristics, the performance parameters, et cetera, all the things that go into that. And so you'd avoid scope creep inherently by just doing that, right? You're saying, okay, I'm not going to try to boil the ocean here. I'm not going to try to create a system that's overly complex. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to have a conversation with my customer about, let's talk about what minimum viable looks like, right? What's the minimally useful to the warfighter, right? What's the absolute minimum they can get by with that helps them do what's needed? That kind of thought process. And then if you use that as the goal and you develop to that goal, and you always have that MVP up on the wall, so to speak, and you're always looking at it, and you're always referencing what you do to that all that helps you avoid, you think of doing something extra, you look at the wall and say, oh, wait a minute, that's outside our definition. We're not going to do that. At least not now. We may do it later.
Yeah, so once I'm typing, it's a way to manage the gold plating.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and do last call from the chat. Another comments coming in here. So last call, any other thoughts, any other specific questions relative to our discussion on how you could apply any of this and enhance your planning? It looks like the answer is no. So I'm going to go ahead and call this second session, another great success. I did see in the chat where someone could not actually download the white paper. So I will take care of that, and I will work through Daryl to get that white paper out to everyone who called into this call. And then we will see you on November 17th. Bring your own snacks. Maybe I'll bring some to the next IPMD meeting I'm at, although they feed us pretty well. Anyway, I thank you all for your time and your attendance, and please follow up at any time. If you do have any questions, I will get them added to our luncheon learn topics, and we will see you November 17th.
Thanks, Andrea. And I know you had
Thank
another
you.
commitment at 1 o'clock.